But now let me, again, get to the main event and introduce our esteemed guest for this evening, Mayor Joni Durkan, who is a Seattle local. Grew up in Seattle, went off to another Catholic school a little bit east of here for undergraduate, then went to Alaska for a while where she taught and coached basketball in a Yupik village in Alaska. Decided to come back to Seattle, earn her JD, and got into law. She rose to become she became the U.S. Attorney for the Western District of Washington, the first openly gay U.S. District Attorney from 2009 to 2014. During that time, she was back here again and honored in 2011 as Woman of the Year by the law school and the Women's Law Caucus. We mentioned she was here as a candidate. She was elected and entered office on November 28th, 2017, with the focus specifically on the challenge of making Seattle affordable and inclusive for all. She's focused on the housing affordability crisis, which affects everyone probably in this room, helping those experiencing homelessness, free college tuition to Seattle's high school graduates, and pushing reforms and restoring trust in the police department. It's our great pleasure to introduce Seattle's Mayor, Joni Durkan.
Well, I'm glad you're here tonight. Thank you, Mayor Durkan, for coming. We're going to be talking about the issue of maintaining livability in a boomtown, which certainly Seattle is. There are many issues we could cover because that's a fairly broad umbrella. We're going to be covering a few issues like affordable housing, homelessness, transportation issues, and of course, population density. And Joni and I will be asking questions at the beginning, but please get some questions ready for you because we're going to give you an opportunity to ask questions directly of the mayor once we finish the questions, Joni and I do. So without further ado, Joni, do you want to start?
Hi, everybody. Thank you for being here. Appreciate it. So Mayor Durkan, we want to start with growth because that's the sort of driving factor here. So given our geographic constraints here, how much more growth is expected and how much is desirable? We know, for example, we read in the paper all the time that Amazon now employs 54,000 people and they have job openings for something like 8,000, 9,000, something like that. Well, how can we maintain livability here if we're constantly adding new people?
So great question. So first, thank you for having me, Father Steve. Thank you for that kind introduction. And always great to be back at Seattle University. I have 3 brothers who graduated from SU. So you guys, if you're students here, you're an amazing university. Seattle, I am a little known fact. I am the first elected mayor of the city of Seattle who was born in Seattle.
Oh, that's right.
So think about that. So in one regard, this city has always been a city that people come to. Unless you're Native American and of Duwamish heritage or Muckleshoot heritage, you came here at some point. And we have just had unprecedented growth in the last 10 years. Our city grew so rapidly. For a period of time, there were 1,000 people a month, moving to Seattle. And we weren't ready for it. There was no part of our city that was ready for that growth. Our infrastructure wasn't ready, so our roads weren't ready. Our housing structure wasn't ready. We didn't have enough affordable homes. Our social services weren't, so we had this homeless crisis. So we have been playing catch up in so many ways, from public transportation to housing. And so on the one hand, I think, I'd like to ask this question. How many of you in the audience, if you could do it right now today, raise your hand if you would just kind of stop growth and Seattle could catch its breath and catch up for housing and everything else. Don't be shy. Now hold them up high. Now I want you to keep your hand up if you were born here. Right? So there's always that tension of when do we pull the door down and say, let's wait for a minute. I think many of us have reached that point where we just feel like, look, just from a point of humanity, we need to have things catch up. But that's not going to happen. So to answer your question is, we're going to keep growing. And what is the optimal amount of growth? I don't know the answer to that, but I'm kind of a geek sometimes. I'm reading this book about London in the 1800s. London was almost exactly the size of Seattle today. had just over 700,000 people. They were in the midst of the Industrial Revolution. We're in the middle of the changing economy that is, I think, going to be more transformative than the Industrial Revolution was. A common feature of London that time was over 5,000 constant, they called them beggars. And so we know from history that these things happen. What do we do to make it better? We know what we have to do. First, number one, more housing. More housing of every single kind. That means low-income housing, middle-class housing, as quickly as we can. But we gotta do it smart. Because I've seen, maybe because I'm a native here, we have added density, which we have to do even more of. But we're also not adding some of those livability features like parks and green space and public realm. So I think we have to be really intentional about how we do that. We also have to provide real opportunity. So many of these jobs, someone put it really well when I was running for office, and I've heard the same thing expressed since then, it's like the growth came and pushed us all down. It was put on top of us because so many of the jobs that were created were not filled with people from Seattle, they were filled by people who moved to Seattle. And so what we also have to do is provide real opportunity for the youth that is here today. And that means good pre-K, so kids show up ready to learn, closing the opportunity gap, particularly for our students of color. And what I'm really, really proud of is 2 years free college for every Seattle public school student.
So I'm thinking about the Amazon effect here and recalling the election last week, which didn't go that well for Amazon. And I wonder, is there some possibility, just from trying to gauge the rate of growth that will keep coming, is there some possibility that that particular battle in Seattle that they had at the election will actually sort of aggravate them and make them, maybe go more to Bellevue? HQ2 sort of happened when they first realized that they were not in the best relationship with the city council.
So I don't think they're breaking up with us.
Okay.
Look, in 1 week period, I was able to announce that Expedia was returning to Seattle, which it will be doing, and with that comes about 5,000 jobs in Seattle. Apple moved to Seattle in the first biggest way, starting with 2,500, but purchasing a building that will be up to 5,000. So I think we have to assume, given who's here, Google, Facebook, all those tech companies, they create an ecosystem that the best place for them to be is where there's that other talent. It started with Microsoft, it had other things, so I don't think that they will, look, those jobs are portable, and they're already growing in other areas in a really big way, in Virginia, in Bellevue. But what we have to do here is, one, keep an environment where people want to stay and live, because that's the number one thing that companies are going to gauge. And that means building a livable Seattle. We get back to the same thing. We have to have places for people to live close to where they work. We have to have good public transportation so people don't get into their cars. And we have to have places that people can walk to the restaurants they like, to their office and others.
Okay, not only are we a boomtown, but actually between 2012 and 2017, we were the fastest growing city at about 14.2%. You've already addressed the issue of growth. I'm wondering, at some point in the future, first of all, I guess, are you as the mayor and the city council, are you able to limit growth? And if you were able to limit growth at some point in the future, how might you do that?
You cannot limit growth by nobody gets to enter. I think you end up limiting growth by what your public policy is and what's available. For example, when I was growing up here, the Central District in Seattle was over 70% African American. They owned the businesses, that's where the churches were, the community. Today it's less than 14%. Our communities of color have been pushed out so rapidly, we've limited the growth of diversity if we don't change our policies. We have to make sure that we have ways for people to stay in their communities, and we have anti-displacement, anti-gentrification policies and practices, but we also have to have enough affordable housing that people can afford to live here. I mean, more and more people feel like they have no toehold in this city. And if we're going to succeed as a city, I think we have to really consciously build that ability for people to live here. Because the number one way you limit growth is that you don't have enough places for people to live. We saw that happen, but we're becoming a city of very, very wealthy and poor. That's not a city any of us want to live in. So I think that we really have to come together and say intentionally, how do we make sure that our nurses, our teachers, our city workers, our firefighters can live in the city, And how do we make sure that we have that kind of rich diversity, that if we squint our eyes when we're done tearing up every block of this city, we actually build the city that we want. That's got to be our goal. Every decision is not just how do we solve the emergency of today. Every decision has to be how does it get us closer to that city that 10 years and 20 years is generationally better than where we are today.
But could we actually take some policies that would actually limit growth? And is that the path that we should be taking at some point in the future?
No, I don't think we can. I don't think that that is realistic. I think that there is, you could get into what the economists believe in limits growth, but I think we will continue to be a city that people come to for a whole range of reasons. But at the same time, the economy can be very fickle. I still remember from my childhood, I was living here when Boeing had about 145,000 people working in the Seattle region. And they lost a major contract, other economic things happened, and literally they went down to about 35,000, I think it was. Friends of mine disappeared overnight as a kid, bicycling around neighborhoods with empty house after empty house after empty house. And so I think, while it may be appealing to limit growth, but we really have to be thinking about what is the smart growth we're going to have: backbone, transportation system, housing, and equity.
So elections have consequences, and one of the consequences of our recent election is that there may be another version of the head tax. What do you think about that? Is there some kind of a head tax that you would support?
So
you have kind of a different council coming.
I think that is a question a lot of people are asking. I've met now since the election, with 5 council members, including all 4 new ones, and I meet with council members on a regular basis. I don't hear a drumbeat for that. I think people are looking first, what is the challenge we have to fix, and what revenues do we need to fix it? So I think you will see a whole range of proposals, and I think we have to gauge each one on their merits. If you look in the last year, there's been new revenue proposals that I proposed. I proposed with our fair share driving that we not only give every Uber and Lyft driver minimum wage, which I think is right, but we also tack on 50 cents per ride, and we're going to be creating over $150 million over 5 years, split between housing and transportation. That's a lot of money. So I think you'll see a range of revenue proposals, and I think the council's going to look first at what is the challenge we need to fix, and then second, what's the right way to get there?
Well, is one possibility, other large tech companies in other places, like Apple, have donated huge amounts of money, like $2.5 billion down in California, for housing availability and affordability. Here we have Microsoft has really stepped up in this very area. Is that something, do you see yourself, has anybody called from Amazon, like they want to jump into it that way instead of like a tax that comes at them? I absolutely think that's got to be one of the features. I think Microsoft led the way with about $500 million, most of it of low-interest loans, that they could juice the market so that housing that wouldn't get built otherwise because a deal didn't pencil, they're going to make their money available. Apple, it's over $2 billion when you add what Apple and the other companies there are doing. So I think we need it, but I don't think it's an or. I think we need and strategies. There's going to have to be a whole range of tools. If we want to address the need for housing in a region, and we really want to make sure that we continue to make progress and even more progress on homelessness, we know we need to do different things and more things.
Okay, I'd like to talk about an act that was passed unanimously by the City Council back in March, the Mandatory Housing Affordability Act, which actually gave developers 2 options when creating new buildings. They could choose the performance option, which required them to include affordable housing in their development, or they could choose the payment option, which required them to pay between $5 to $32.75 per square foot. Why did you decide to give them those options?
So that was in the legislation before I came in, and it was passed as that. I inserted, when the final MHA mandatory housing affordability went through, I put in there a rider and my signing statement that we're going to be studying it, because I will tell you, the pro of having people put into the pot is that we can then take that money in total, and it's a larger sum of money you can then leverage to build more housing. But a lot of the data and study that's now coming out of a project that a person named Raj Shetty has done, using Seattle Housing Authority data and other data, really clearly shows that if you particularly give young kids the opportunity to grow up in high opportunity areas, their outcomes in life are demonstrably better. And so I think that my personal bias is that even though we can have more money that we can leverage if you put it all in the pot, I believe we have to start moving more towards on-site. Because I think when someone walks through the front door, you shouldn't know whether they're rich or poor. It's just that they live there. And I think that we've got to do that for the kids and for the families, and we need to do it every part of Seattle. So I think there's going to be a balancing act, but we really have to look at what is the right ratio, and if we can get, are we able to commit other revenues towards housing, how do we make sure that we're not building the housing today that is the segregation of tomorrow?
Moving along to homelessness, which, as you know, Seattle voters believe is the #1 issue in the city. So the city is currently working with the county to form a regional entity to deal with homelessness. How will creating this new governance structure affect the day-to-day lives of the homeless people and sort of our overall response to homelessness?
So that is a really good question. It sounds like just a wonky thing to have a regional governance, but I've spent together with a lot of experts and some people in this room a lot of time looking at this issue and going to other cities to see what works in different places. And pretty universally, there is unanimity around what issue, which is if you really want to make progress, you have to treat it holistically and you have to have all the tools under one roof. And right now, the city of Seattle controls the shelter dollars and some of the housing dollars through our Office of Housing. And the county controls the behavioral health dollars, both the mental health and the addiction. We need to treat it holistically and have it under one roof going in the same direction. But we also know that, look, these issues don't stop at city lines. Homelessness is a problem everywhere in America and everywhere in this region. And if we have a regional governance system, we can make sure that we start thinking about how do we tie policies together and addressing those so that people in their communities can stay in their communities, be supported in their communities. And really the only way to get to where we need, I think, is to have everybody under one roof thinking together as a region, how do we tackle these challenges? And if we get that, we will continue. We already have seen really marked improvements by aligning our efforts. We're the only major city on the West Coast that the one night count went down. Only one. Everybody else went up. We went down, depending on how you calculate it, by about 8%.
What are those numbers in Seattle? What is the drop?
The drop is about 8%, and the raw numbers, depending on how you calculate shelter and unsheltered, they change the definition a little bit, which gets a little wonky. But the bottom line is, what we know is we brought more people inside, not just into our shelter system, but we were able to get more people in long-term housing than ever before in a year's period. So we know what works, and now we have to scale it, not just in Seattle, but regionally.
With regard to homelessness, what would you say are the 2 or 3 most important actions that you've taken in your administration that your predecessors hadn't?
So I don't know that my predecessors didn't, but I'll tell you what I think the 3 most important things that we did in the last year. The first was to listen to people with lived experience. Too often government thinks it has the solution and it bakes that solution without really listening to the experience of the people and understanding what do they need to be stabilized and to get housing. The second was I came in thinking, okay, we're going to build 1,000 tiny houses and that's how we're going to do it. The more I learned, really what the issue was is that our shelter system was not built for kind of the population of people experiencing homelessness today. It was kind of your old 50s, 60s, and 70s, which is to say, often mission related, a person checks in at 6 o'clock, they say their prayer, they get their chow, they get a mat on the floor or a bunk, and then they're back on the street at 7. And they don't get any of the enhanced services that they need. Couples can't go together. And it's just this constant trauma-inducing cycle. So we shifted to what we call were enhanced shelters, because it showed that enhanced shelters were much more positive, both for people's lives and for getting people long-term housing. So we flipped almost the reverse ratio. So the majority of our shelter system now is what we call enhanced shelter. That means we get services to people, get them caseworkers, get them stabilized, have shelters that you can come in at different hours. And we have seen that enhanced shelters, 5 times more successful at getting people into long-term housing. 5 times more successful. So enhanced shelters, so that. The second was building more shelters. We just had not enough places to bring people inside. And if you don't have places to bring people inside and get them stabilized, I don't believe you can then make that transition to long-term housing. So we increased shelter by about 25%, and we saw that made a marked difference.
What's been your main frustration in dealing with this issue?
It's a couple of things. One is, I think people lose sight of the humanity. We, at different times, I think people become bogged down in a debate about whether you're for public safety or the homeless. And it is a completely false choice. And so one is to always remind ourselves that we are dealing with fellow humans who have different challenges than we have. And we always have to do it through that framework. So I think that's one real big frustration. The second is that we have, while the problems manifest themselves right here in our city streets the most, we have the fewest tools. Really, the federal government, the state government, and the county government have tools that we have to employ. You look at the issue of mental health, for example. You know, we went through the periods of the 80s and the 90s where we said we needed to deinstitutionalize people, which was the right choice. But the myth was we were going to create enough support in community to have community health, and we didn't. So I think bringing the right tools to the fight and making sure that everybody stands up and says, look, this isn't your problem or your problem, it is our collective challenge, and we've got to face it together.
Is it realistic to think that the federal government, this administration, is going to help us?
Yes.
How so?
In ways that we don't expect.
Oh.
So number one is the Congress is close, I think, to passing bipartisan again, the low-income housing tax credit. The way that works is in order to do real estate deals, people expect to get a return. And if you have to charge rent and the only thing you get is the rent back, a deal doesn't pencil if you don't charge people money. So the low-income housing tax credit basically gives a layer of financing that allows a deal to work for the people that are investing, but there's only so much of it that every state gets and every community gets, and we pretty much almost tapped ours out. Maria Cantwell and others have worked bipartisan in Congress to say, let's increase that. So I think we'll see an increase of that. I also think that there is a chance still that an infrastructure bill will go through, because it won't this year, but next year, every congressman is up for election, and I hate to be cynical, but they want to bring something home. And so if there's an infrastructure bill, there's a big push to include money for public housing, which we haven't had in a very long time. So while they won't help us ever on the social policy, we may be able to get some of those federal dollars.
You said earlier that a lot of other cities are seeing their homeless numbers go up, and we had this decline. At the end of your first term, and you're 2 years away from that, at the end of your first term, do you think the homeless number will be lower than it is today? And if so, why?
I hope that it will be. I don't think anyone can say for certainty what will happen, but I believe we know the strategies. I believe we are increasing to have a collective will to do more. And it's because I talk to mayors and council members and people, not just in Seattle, but the mayor of Auburn and Kirkland and Renton and Federal Way. They're facing the same thing, Tacoma and Everett. And you go east of the mountains, and people understand that while Seattle has the most manifest problem, everybody knows that this is an issue they've got to deal with. And if you look, it's so tied to the cost of housing. Right now, the fastest appreciating housing is Tacoma.
Yeah.
I mean, and you think about what's happening in Tacoma now, and you can see how that's reverberating through their community. So I believe that there is a collective consciousness. I'm just hoping that that political will matches it.
You've already mentioned tiny houses, and I'm wondering, Do you think there would be, further on in your administration, that you'd like to build, create the situation where there are more tiny houses that are built?
Yes. And it was funny because when I came in and we started our first tiny house projects, there was a lot of criticism, maybe even you, Joni.
I can't imagine.
I doubt that. And people were like, oh, they're garden sheds, they're this, they're that. Look, they're not ideal and they're not a home. And no one should think they are. But they have some things that we have found from just a pure humanity thing have made a huge difference. One, they have a locking door. Someone can walk in, have their stuff there, and lock the door and have quiet and privacy and some sanctity. We now know from our data this year, we have moved more people from tiny house villages to permanent housing than any of our other shelter systems. And as that has happened, people have seen that it does create community. And so almost on the flip, one of the challenges we've had is people that once they're in that community want to keep it. And how do you say, no, we need to get you the enhanced services and get you long-term housing? And it's this balance between the community that forms. But I think tiny house villages, while not a long-term solution, really are much better than a tent, much better than moving around in different places. And the stability they give people, I think, is really more than we anticipated.
Some members of the Seattle City Council do not support navigation teams, and this is part of the budget discussions going on right now, although I think that they are probably today remaining in the budget, but they're controversial as well. But so why do you support the navigation teams? And if we don't use those, what is the alternative? So first we should explain what the navigation teams
So
do.
navigation team is a cross-disciplinary team that has both police officers, outreach workers, and social workers that goes into encampments, does outreach, and tries to get people to first come into shelter and then into housing. They are controversial because some people believe that you should not try to relocate people from encampments. And so I think that's where the controversy comes from. But there is no question in my mind, I mean, almost to a person, if someone spends time going with the navigation team, it is a remarkable thing what they do. And I think it's too bad that it's controversial because their work is some of the toughest work we have in the city. And they are in some of the most inhumane conditions in some of these encampments where they literally are in talking with people, greeting people, meeting them where they are. And the stories coming out are real. You know, there's one woman who, recently was in one of the press accounts who, because of the navigation team, able to bring her inside. She and her child were sleeping outside for a very long time, moving from place to place. They were able to bring her first into shelter and then into long-term housing. During our snowstorm, literally, they were working 24/7, going out into the snow, trying to get people safe and inside, and moved hundreds of people from tents into our temporary and emergency shelter. And I spent time in each of those emergency shelters that we stood up. And I will tell you that it was, for those people, everything, themselves volunteering to help cook, to having people who provided haircuts in the shelters, which sounds like a small thing, but is a big thing. So I think the navigation team, without it, we will not be able to move people literally from encampments to shelter to house, because right now our law requires that kind of outreach and engagement. But factually also did not have that tool, I think, would set us back, and I think that's the wrong direction to go.
Okay, we're going to move on to transportation now. We just recently found that the victory of Initiative 976. And we're just wondering, how are you going to handle that, which will be a tremendous drop in infrastructure spending if it actually is fully implemented?
Yeah, if it is fully implemented, it's catastrophic to the city of Seattle because it devastates the money that we voted for ourselves for our transportation benefit district. So tens of thousands of bus hours will go away. Sound Transit will have some jeopardy to some of its funding going forward. So we're going to do a number of things. First, values. We need more transit, not less transit. If we want to be moving people in a way that's friendly to climate, that reduces traffic, that gets people to here, we need more transit, not less transit. And the city of Seattle votes in a couple different ways. Number one, we voted to tax ourselves to get more transit when the county didn't. Number two, we vote with our feet. Unlike other major cities, our transit use is going up. Other cities are trying to figure out how to get people into transit. We're trying to figure out how to get more transit. So the one thing I will tell you, I will pledge to you as mayor, I'm going to do everything I can, not just to keep what we have, but keep adding to transit, because we have to do it. Two, we have a layers of strategies. One is we have a legal strategy, and I think we have a very good chance of winning our lawsuit that this was an unconstitutional exercise.
How so? There's a bunch of legal arguments that people are talking about. Which is your strongest?
So I think there's two that are strongest. One, look, citizens have the right to pass laws. That is part of who we are in the West. That's what the initiatives and referendums are all about. But you're bound to the same rules as anyone else for a law, so you can only do one subject in a lot of time. And the single subject rule, time and time again by Tim Eyman, his laws have been thrown out for that. Second is, people say that I'm suing voters because I want to stop this. Not true. Our city voted to have taxes to support our transit. I don't think the state or Tim Eyman can take that away. So I think that those are two very good arguments that say, number one, your law is unconstitutional, and two, we just want to keep what our voters have voted for. If Spokane or other cities don't want it, let them vote not to have it. But he said during the campaign is, oh, we'll preserve voters have the right to pass it. Not true under the law.
So this gets a little wonky, but you're a lawyer by training.
Is that she's saying I'm wonky?
No, I said you're a lawyer by training. One of the other arguments, and maybe one of the better ones from some of the folks I've spoken to, is that this initiative interferes with Sound Transit in this way, that Sound Transit, its expansion relies on bonds that were sold, and the bonds are backed by the car tabs. And so breaking that arrangement is somehow the better legal argument.
Yeah, and that's for Sound Transit because we didn't bond against ours. So for the city, that argument is not as strong. But Sound Transit, there's been case law. Once you form a contract based on that revenue, you can't retroactively break it. So I think that's a very good argument. Now look, we'll see what happens. And I do think there's been a lot of discussion about should government have been more straight about what the value of cars are. And I think we got to have an honest conversation about that.
That's been going on for a long time. So for those of you who don't know, some of the car tabs are based on cars that are valued a little higher than the standard Blue Book. And that the voters who know about that are aggravated by it.
Yeah.
Let's talk about e-scooters.
Let's talk scooters.
Initially you were against it, but now you're for them. Why did you change your position?
So my position has been the same throughout. I believe, and this is actually backed up now by all the public health people, that there is a real and legitimate public health issue related to scooter use. And the cities that have them have seen an increase of number of people that have been harmed and people that end up with very catastrophic head injuries. So the public health issue is real and it has to be dealt with. Second, related to that is the way the scooter contracts were written is if someone got hurt on a scooter, guess who didn't pay? The scooter companies. You know, it left scooter users sometimes with no remedy except for to sue the cities. So I wanted to make sure that if they were going to have this, that the scooter companies who are now billion-dollar companies, that they were the ones who were going to be held responsible for injuries they knew could happen. And then the third was we saw nationwide that as the scooters went in, they quit doing bike share. We have the most successful bike share process and program in the country. And it's working great. Over 2 million rides last year on bike share. We want to keep our bikes. So we're in the process right now of having a pilot to make sure they can address the safety issue and the indemnification issue, and to make sure that they keep the bikes here.
How do you ensure the safety of Seattle residents when people on e-scooters, I've already seen a few since I do a lot of walking in the city, often use sidewalks and streets for the e-scooters?
So there's two things is we have to put out the regulations, but under the legislation that was passed in Olympia, we get to restrict where they're operated. And I think that there is a very good chance that we will end up saying they shouldn't be on sidewalks. And depending on the speeds, but some of these, depending on which range they are, can go up to 18 miles an hour. We just know already that our sidewalks are a little bit dangerous sometimes, and particularly dangerous for people who have disabilities. And if you look in some of the other cities, the other challenge related to that is, where do people put them? They end up being just dropped on the sidewalk, sometimes in clumps of 10 and 20 and 30, and make it, great obstructions for both pedestrians.
Also in the lake. They're in the bottom of the lake. Leaking batteries sometimes.
That's right. And then they've got to they're seeing the scooter companies are changing the design of scooters because they saw the little tires didn't work on city streets, and they're building big tires.
So a little off topic, but the e-scooters...
Is there anything off topic?
I don't know.
Is there anything
we'll
off
see.
topic?
The e-scooters and some of the bikes, very few people are wearing helmets. And you talked earlier about, when you have e-scooters come to your city, you see an increase in head injuries.
It's huge. And Dr. Rivera, who's a doctor here in Seattle, works out of Harvard and the University of Washington, literally was one of the initial people who realized and helped pass helmet laws for bicycling. And we saw the number of injuries for bicyclists decline significantly with helmet use. And he and other of the emergency room doctors nationwide have said you've got to have helmets, and you've got to have ones that are designed for higher speeds than bikes. So I think part of the discussion on safety is there a way to make sure that you pair scooter use with helmet use?
I believe you're in favor, you've made several statements in favor of congestion pricing. How do you actually charge people for congestion pricing?
So first you got to make sure you have a strong equity lens. And the first report we got back, very concerned with that, is, again, related to what we talked before, is with gentrification, more and more communities of color and people who can't afford to live in Seattle live further out. And many of them live in areas where there's not good access to transit or good access at the hours they need to go. We don't want to have this be another regressive tax that lands on those shoulders. So first you have to design it for, how do you make sure the right people pay? Second, there's a range of tools you can have, and we're studying what other cities have done. Some, it's the equivalent of, HOV lanes. You've got to have a decal there, and when you come into whatever the cordoned area is, you're automatically charged a certain price. Some others have that there's just basically anybody coming in that area has to pay in a different way. So there's a variety of ways you can charge it, but the first thing we have to do is, what is the equitable way to do it? But we're seeing in some of the cities who have adopted it, first they thought it would just make it a more livable city because you have less congestion, which I think everyone, you've been in that favorite city, imagine, close your eyes, and you always remember walking to a cafe or a restaurant or being on a bike. It's that thing you love, and you don't remember their cars honking at you or having to wait to cross the street. So you want to have fewer cars. It's good for climate, it's good for cities, and you know what they're finding out? Really good for health. Child asthma declining significantly in those cities that have it. So I think there's a tremendous amount of benefits. There's a huge resistance to it. We'll need Olympia's approval, so I think that will be a challenge. But I think we should push ahead and at least come up with a format and a tool that will work, because I think it has a lot of benefits.
Do you think downtown businesses will be harmed if congestion pricing is
No,
implemented?
I think in the long run they'll flourish. I think that we always have this sense that somehow how we do it now is the way to do it. I was in Copenhagen about 4 weeks ago for Climate Summit. And there's a city hundreds of years older than Seattle, huge built environment restrictions. And they have totally transformed how they get in and around that city. Biking, pedestrian, transit, and far fewer cars. And it's fantastic. And the businesses are doing great. So I think you can find ways that actually bring more people in if it's easier for them to come.
There are several European examples of congestion pricing working, but are there any American examples?
No, we right now, I think we in New York are the furthest along of kind of studying it.
So the tax that you mentioned earlier on Uber and Lyft rides, is in a way a form of congestion pricing. It's not time driven, but it's use of roads driven. Is there any chance that looks like it's headed for approval, the Uber and Lyft tax? Is there a chance that makes Uber and Lyft riders sort of mad at the tax, so they drive their cars more and then they circle the block for the parking?
No, in fact, I think it won't. We looked at various models, and New York had even a more significant increase. They're ahead of us, and ridership increased, didn't decrease. So I think that it will not decrease demand and have more people getting into cars, but what it will do is, we've done some studies, they're not perfect, and they have some limitations, but between 30% and 50% of congestion in our city core or South Lake Union is Uber and Lyft cars circling. And so we want to do a number of things. We want to manage our curb space better so they're not, because that's bad for climate, bad for congestion, and be able to have people maybe have waiting areas, geofence things, so that people aren't stopping in the middle of the block, picking up and stopping. So we're going to do not just having the tax, we're going to make sure that there's minimum wage and expenses for the drivers, and then we're going to try to manage our curb space better so that in the end it's better for everybody.
Okay. In recent years, the Seattle Police Department has been having a hard time filling some of the positions for rank and file, and the number of police officers went down. If a city is growing as much as we're growing, how are we doing on that? Don't we need sort of a proportional increase as well in the number of officers?
There's no question we need more police officers. And Chief Carmen Bess and I have been both very focused on this, as she has in the department. We meet on a weekly basis, and one of the things on our topic is always, where are we in hiring and where are we on training? Good news is we are finally seeing we're in a positive territory, and so I think we will start.
Positive, you have more officers?
We're hiring more than we're losing, and we're trending in the right direction, and it's a combination of things. Number one is they went for 4 years with no contract. And we were paying 2014 wages in a 2017-2018 Seattle. Other jurisdictions very close to us were paying more than us, and they were paying $5,000 to lure ours away. So we are trying to both get lateral hires and hire people new, and get them trained, because what we don't want to sacrifice is quality. I mean, we have come such a far way under our consent decree. Last year, over 17,000 crisis calls that police were involved in, and force was used less than 2% of the time, and the majority of that was the lowest level of force. When I was U.S. Attorney and we did our investigation, we concluded that 25% of the time force was used unconstitutionally. We have had a huge shift in the department, and they deserve a lot of credit for that. Our cops are working hard.
Okay, now we're going to go to the audience portion of this so they can ask some questions. And while you're thinking of some questions to ask the mayor, and you can come up here to the front and ask them.
If you have some questions, come on up.
We've actually got two from one of our classes, from our foundations class. So here's one of the questions from the audience. As the tech industry continues to generate change within the city of Seattle, what are your plans for preserving community spaces, such as the Chinatown International District? Right now there are plans for a 27-story mixed-use building to go up on Jackson Street, right across from the light rail station. The planning committee has openly stated that there will be no low-income units provided, despite the fact that the majority of the people who currently live and work in Chinatown are not able to afford market-rate housing. How are you addressing community displacement?
So Chinatown International District is one of our most important culturally and heritage places, and one of the most burdened by racism over the centuries. You know, we had the Chinese Exclusion Act. We had the internment of the Japanese. For a period of time, it was the only place people could live. It is an increasingly senior population, so we have to have an and. Yes, we need market rate there to remain vital, but we have to make sure that we maintain and have more affordable housing. We have to have culturally appropriate services. And one of the biggest challenges is going to be when the light rail goes in, it will have a huge displacing impact that we need to be planning for now.
Another question, one more question from our students is, how do you balance the blowback that comes from pushing for a ban and tax on oil heating in the city, which is mostly relied upon by seniors and low-income people, while also emphasizing that the city should be more affordable and livable? Are the benefits of this move far greater than the consequence of the public's anger to it?
So home heating oil, I think it's a great way of how to gauge a tax to both further a good and make sure that you're equitable. So we know that home heating oil, well, it's used by a relatively small number of people in Seattle, accounted for a significant proportion of our greenhouse gases. By eliminating the use of home heating oil, we would actually reduce our resident home heating, our greenhouse gases significantly, but we also know it's seniors and people who have lower income. So we pass the tax, but then use that money to actually help those people go to cleaner energy. So I think that we were able to do both things with that.
Thank you. Hi, Jenny. Thank you so much for being here. As a student of Seattle U, welcome. My name is Sarah Baker. I'm in the MPA program. I'm also the president of the Seattle chapter of the Japanese American Citizens League, which is the United States' oldest and largest civil rights organization. So earlier you mentioned that neighborhoods like the CID, right, are historically black and brown, but the reason behind that is because of racist laws like redlining, right? And so you talked about how you can support those neighborhoods and maintaining the diversity there, but what I'm wondering is how are you, one, going to combat those types of laws and how they've displaced people previously and presently, and two, what are you doing in terms of police accountability in those neighborhoods to protect black and brown bodies?
That's great. So bunch of questions in there. Let me take them at a bunch at a time. So number one, Chinatown International District and some of the other communities in this area, I think, have very similar concerns. One of the things I did is I issued an executive order, an anti-displacement order that did a couple of things. One is to create a preference system so that as we built low-income housing and affordable housing in a community, the members of that community would have first choice, both those who were there and those who had been displaced, the ability to come back. Because community is so important and we've lost so much of it. So that's one strategy. The other strategy is to make sure that we're investing in the community organizations in those communities because they know best what are the things that are going to work to create the opportunity. Rather than cities saying, hey, we know what's good for you, we've got to invest in the community-based organizations. So we have tried to do that more and more. A third thing we want to do is on police accountability is again to go in and really listen first and then respond with that. Because you will hear from, for example, Chinatown International District, South Park, Lake City Way, Rainier Beach have, well, all of them have black and brown people primarily as their youth, have very different views on what they want for their community at what different levels. And so again, it's listening to community and making sure that you don't have to sacrifice public safety for making sure that you have policing that provides public safety first and foremost by respecting the people there and empowering them. And by also really recognizing, as I think we have in Seattle, is that we had a problem with the police department that was using unconstitutional force. And even though we have made tremendous changes, it is not a destination. It is continuous improvement. And you have that continuous improvement by actually being able to have honest and open conversations, particularly about race and systemic racism. It is really hard in our country for people to have those conversations, particularly for white people who are privileged like myself, to honestly say, I have benefited from things that other people have not. And for example, when I was recently in DC and just touring the African American Museum there and seeing the history of racism and thinking somehow that people then are just going to be magically assimilated into our economy and our society is crazy. So I think at every level we have to really recognize that, and then we have to say, how do we make sure that we provide real opportunities? And everything from listening to the youth in Rainier Beach who say, you know what, we deserve to be able to take transit. And because of them, we now have free Orca passes for every Seattle public school student. You know, things like that, it's listening and then it's acting. So thank you for the questions. And thanks for your work.
Thank you.
Oh, you're gonna hold it, okay. Hello, Mayor Durkan. My name is Annie Tho, and I'm here to talk about saving our trees. I'm wearing this shirt. And I'm representing a neighborhood group that's called the Neighborhood Tree Keepers. And we're about looking at what's going on with the climate crisis right now and the crisis in the boomtown of Seattle with development right now, and that there's a real crisis with our tree ordinance. And I've talked with all kinds of people. I've talked to the mayor of Cambridge, Massachusetts, the vice mayor there. They did a moratorium there to stop tree cutting because things had gotten so out of hand with their tree ordinance. I'm so concerned because I've watched huge areas of old trees, 80 to 100 to 120 years old, getting clear cut, 25 in one lot alone, that we can't replace in our lifetime or our children's lifetimes. And those have an impact not only on livability, because trees, it's shown that it decreases crime, it increases mental health, physical health, 5 times more asthma in South Seattle because they don't have as many trees there. So many health impacts that we haven't even calculated from cutting trees down. And of course, we need trees for lumber, that's obvious, and some trees
Could you get to the question, please?
So what can we do to protect our trees? I know there's an ordinance that the UFC is working on, the urban forestry is working on, but it's been 10 years. What can we do, and can you help us?
Yes and yes. So here's what we have to do is, we took a pass at it. Rob Johnson, as you know, who was the city councilman, was kind of leading it, then he left. I think with the new council, there's going to be a great opportunity to have this issue. And I think we've got to get it teed up really early because it works in conflict in some ways. Okay, we all want more density, and we want to have more equity, particularly in single-family neighborhoods. But we just did a survey of trying to figure out, for example, of our tree cover, which we need for all the reasons you cited and for climate. You know, where is it? Where do we need to preserve? Where do we need to add? About 80% of our tree cover is in our single-family neighborhoods. So as we add density, we have to be really conscious about how we trade that off and make sure we preserve. And then we need to have more trees in more places. And we need to have a whole urban forestry push. It's part of livability. So I think green is who we are in our heart, and we need to get back there.
Oh, okay. Hi, my name's Jasmine. I'm the president of Black Student Union that's sitting over there. And I have a couple of questions. My first question is just like, you briefly mentioned like systemic racism and systemic injustice, and I was just wondering, do you feel like it's necessary to educate students on that, like beginning in public schools? And what's your opinion on it? And then also I'm interested in your affordable housing plan. Like, how do you plan on implementing that? And then does it involve rent caps? And if it does involve rent caps, how do you plan to address like possible racial discrimination in the implementation of those rental controls?
All right, a lot to unpack there. So, look, there is no part of American society that is not impacted by systemic racism. There just isn't. And so education starts with being honest about that and being honest from the youngest ages possible. I think that government plays a huge role in that, because not just in the policies we pass, but how do we conduct ourselves? So when I came in, one of the first executive orders that I signed at Wing Luke and Chinatown ID was to really confirm our commitment to our race and social justice and making sure that we as an employer and a city were acting with those same values and principles. And we're not perfect. We got a long ways to go, but I think you have to both have the policies, but you got to model it too. Second, we have to really look at each of our things that are affecting people's lives, looking through that lens and thinking, are we actually dismantling the systems that are holding people down, or are we keeping them in place in a different way? And so, you know, I think that opportunity starts with good prenatal care. I mean, I really believe that if we really want to make sure that people have an opportunity, you have to start young. But that means, for example, in having good preschool. The City of Seattle passed a law, you know, our Opportunity Promise Law, the Families and Education Levy, that doubles the amount of pre-K, which doesn't sound like much, but most of it is for families that could never afford it. Those kids then show up to kindergarten ready to learn. And then we have to work on K through 12 to close that opportunity gap, because if you look at the outcomes for kids of color, and particularly for African American males, they are significantly lower than for white kids. We can and must fix that. And so we've got to work with the schools to make that change. And then we have to say is, if you do what we ask of you and you stay in school and you learn, we're gonna live up to our part. We're not just gonna give you 2 years free college. The next phase this year we're working on is, for every kid that's in that Promise program, we wanna give you internships and jobs. for the things that when you come out, you have family wage jobs and the thing that is your dream. And so, I think we have to look at every step to say, how do we do better? Because there is no question that in our city, prosperity has not been shared as it should be shared. And we have the ability to fix that, and if we don't, shame on us.
Hi, I'm Sarah Jane Siegfried, and I'm one of the organizers of the Seattle Coalition for Affordability, Livability, and Equity that appealed the environmental impact statement of the mandatory housing affordability, and have been blamed for a lot of it as supposedly we're against growth. Well, that's really dumb. That's like being opposed to gravity. We're not. But we do have an objection to the way it was done, which was top-down. So I'm going to tie this into asking you, I think this goes back to the distrust of government. And I think this is one of the things that we all really need to address in the upcoming year or two. And I have some suggestions of how we might do that, and I hope we have your leadership in doing it. So the first one would be define livability in a community-wide process. This could be 3 months or so. But this was never defined in HALA. It's the Housing Affordability and Livability Agenda, and they never addressed livability.
Yeah.
So let's find out what it is so we can talk about that. And then second, go back to neighborhood planning. It was summarily taken out of the comprehensive plan last January as part of MHA. And then we have this top-down process that, again, causes distrust of government. So can we put neighborhood planning back in the mix? Can we restore concurrency, as you suggested?
So it'd be really helpful if you would ask like a single question that she could address.
My suggestions of how to restore trust in government, and ask you to address that.
So the short answer is I think every law we pass is iterative and we have to learn and get better. I think there's some areas where you and I might not agree on MHA what we need to do better, but I do think we have to also make sure that as we grow in a way that is very intentional and very smart. But we have to also do it so that it advances equity and opportunity. It should not be that a kid who's born and raised in South Park has a lower life expectation than a kid who's born and raised in Laurelhurst. That's wrong, and we're better than that. So I think Yes, so I think we really have to, when we talk about community and neighborhoods, I think it's not just how do we do growth, it is how do we make sure that we actually are giving those neighborhoods and communities an equitable shot at every opportunity. And if we do that right, I think we can solve some of the other issues you're worried about. Correct.
Thank you.
Hi there. Hello.
Hey.
Hey.
Hi. My name is Kelly Kirk. Wow, I have been in Seattle 1 week, so it's really...
One of the 1,000 people who moved here this week.
Yeah, I guess.
Let's hear it for Kelly.
Come on. Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you. And I'll say, my husband and I have been living in Shanghai, China the past 5 years, and so we really saw Seattle as a really cool place
And you were right.
plant. I mean, and so I will say, like, one thing, I'm just, like, number one, like, blown away by every single thing about this place, and of course it's the honeymoon phase, but also I come here reawoken as a U.S. citizen because I'd so long lived in the U.S. Now I've lived overseas. I've seen successful transit. I've seen, just like, that's one. I'll focus on one thing because this is one question. Okay, I've seen successful, spectacular public transit, like buses, trains, cars, like everything, the bikes. I'm so excited you guys have bikes here because they're so amazing and it's just incredible. And I don't know how can I use like my passion and my reawokenness and knowledge of the world to be useful here. What would you like? Yeah, like how can I guess
put her to work.
Like we have so many hours a day, and I guess that's something too. In China, they're working every day, and you come here, people are like hanging out, and I'm like, I want to get to work. And I guess how can you?
We got jobs for you.
Sure. So I guess like Indeed.com. But I guess like what do you suggest that, sure, even all of us, even if we're not getting paid for it, what are some habits or something or ways that we can really start doing stuff outside of just talk? What do you want? I guess what do you want from us? What would you tell us, Yeah.
I like it. Can we get your contact information?
Yeah, sure.
No, seriously though, showing up is number one.
Yeah.
Showing up and listening is number one, and then keeping action. So we got a range of things we can plug you into, no joke.
Cool.
And I'm sure there's lots of people out here who are like, okay, we got jobs for you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
But welcome.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Cool. There's lots and lots and lots of seats on the transit, so that's at least a
Yeah. There we go. All right.
Go to
Good evening, Mayor Durkan. So my name is Steve Zemke. I'm
Steve, I'm going to interrupt you just for a second. So you were here at the end of last week when they wrote a silly article that said Seattle was the gloomiest place. I was just going to say fake news. But then we lived through yesterday. Yesterday was so gloomy. But sorry, Steve.
That's fine. Yeah, my name's Steve Zemke. I'm Vice Chair of the Urban Forestry Commission. I've been there for 6 years. I'm also Chair of Tree Pack. I'm speaking as a member of Tree Pack tonight. You have a provision in the current tree ordinance that hasn't been enforced for 18 years, which actually is a solution to part of our problem in the city. That is replaced, besides trying to preserve trees, we need to replace the trees that have been removed. There's a provision in there, we've written to you about that and other city council members, et cetera, that says all trees removed by developers that are 24 inches and larger and all exceptional trees must be replaced either on site or the city will replace them someplace else. That provision's been there 18 years. It's not enforced because you only need to ask 2 questions. Where are the trees if they replaced them? And where's the money the city would have got because the city wouldn't do it for free? So my question is, will you please look into that as the Urban Forestry Commission, as citizens have asked you, and enforce that particular ordinance, because that would really help with areas like South Seattle, et cetera, where we need trees?
We have to, the short answer is yes, but we need to do it all. And we got to make sure that when it's tree replacement, it's not like you got to take down a big tree and put in a sapling, okay? And that's what you saw in a lot of developments would they'd clear a lot and then there'd be a few little very sad trees stuck in the ground. So we got to do more. We're going to do better. We're going to tackle trees next year.
No, I think you will. And the draft the Urban Forestry Commission sent you actually looked at replacing equivalents in tree canopy volume, which is very important. It's a mistake that Portland made. They just replaced tree for tree. So big trees got replaced with small trees. Your tree regulation research project that the city did said big trees are being removed. What you said now being replaced.
Thanks, Steve.
We can move on now.
Thanks, Steve.
We have time for 2 more questions.
Hey, Mayor Durkan.
How are you?
Doing well. My name is Isaac Pearson. Hopefully I speak up. All right, my name is Isaac Pearson. I'm a criminal justice major here at Seattle U. I'm a member of BSU, but even more importantly, I'm a 4th generation member of the Central District community. And I understand that.
What's your last name?
Say it again.
What's your last name?
Pearson.
I might know your family.
Okay, maybe. But I understand that the new youth jail is set to open sometime next year. Obviously, that affects my community, which is ever so changing for many reasons. I just wanted to know, jails are built with the intention to fill them. So my question is, what preventative measures or resources are you hoping to implement within that community, the Central District, and the ones beyond, to kind of minimize the number of youth, which will most likely be Black and brown youth, that might house those jails?
Yeah, great question, and we have to do a whole bunch of things. I had the great opportunity, right before I came here, I was meeting with a group of youth who were in Choose 180 program. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it's a program that is geared towards youth who become criminally justice involved, to do basically peer-to-peer, to talk to them about ways where they don't get into trouble again and have it as an alternative to incarceration. And they are doing some really good work, but it comes mostly after people are criminally justice involved. We need to do more before. And so I think that we have to, again, I know it sounds, I don't mean to sound glib, but it's got to start, every kid from when they are the youngest has to both believe in and have actually the opportunity to fulfill who they are. And we can't pretend that everybody starts from the same place. And so we need to be investing more in our youth of color, particularly young men, because if you look at the outcomes, it is clear what's happening in the criminal justice system. I started out as a criminal defense lawyer and fought for alternatives to incarceration when I was there, trying to get programs in place, trying to get a lot of diversionary programs. So it's got to be both change the criminal justice system itself, make sure that we have really meaningful reentry for those who do come criminally justice involved so they actually have opportunity and not have strikes against them, and then also provide real opportunity so that kids have a choice at each stage of their lives to make good choices. And we haven't done right on any one of those things. We have to do better by those who are criminally justice involved to take away the fact that once you are, it makes it harder to get housing and a job and everything else. And so we got to change that too. One of the things that sounds like a small thing when we came in is, marijuana is now legal in Seattle. But you had a lot of people who were convicted of marijuana possession charges where it would be legal today. So I worked with Pete Holmes. We convinced the court to vacate hundreds of convictions so that people wouldn't have that on their record. And so we have to be looking at each of the places where we know there's obstacles and blow those obstacles away. We need to get to a place where, that incarceration of youth is something that we think we not only don't need it, why did we ever have to do that?
So the last question, because we're running out of time here. Ryan, one of my students.
Hello,
Yay.
hello. My name is Ryan Sunholtz. I'm a senior at Seattle U. I'm a student in Joni's class. I moved here
Is
last
she
year.
any good?
Huh?
Is she any good?
Oh, she's amazing.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a great class. I moved here last year from Chicago, and so last winter was my first one in Seattle, and I was largely shocked by the lack of infrastructure with the snow here. Daily lives were affected. I was unable to come to school.
But it only lasted a week.
But,
Or
classes
three.
were missed for days, and there's no snowplows, and Seattle is very hilly, and we're not built here to handle snow, but I'm wondering what's being done.
But the scooters are going to do awesome in the snow.
But I'm wondering, is there any policy and planning being done for this winter? We're still going to get snow here, and I'm wondering, is there anything safety-wise and policy-wise being done to avoid the interruption of daily live activities that were so largely impacted last winter?
So yes and no. I will say, first, I think the thing that we did really awesome, I think overall in getting through the snow last year, may not have felt like it from Chicago, but we, I think, did better than we'd done before, but we saw some places that we didn't do well. Number one is educating people who own homes, their obligations on the sidewalk. And there were many parts of town where sidewalks weren't passable because people didn't know they had those obligations. And it was really a problem for people, again, who have disabilities, trying to get from here to there, that then literally had no options. So we've got to do better on that front. But I think that in big snows in Seattle, you just got to expect things are going to shut down for a while. The best thing you can do is stock up and stay home.
So Mayor Durkan, final here, 2 years in, what do you think is the biggest challenge, like something that maybe even surprised you of being a mayor of a boomtown like this?
So the thing is, there's two parts of it. One is, I don't know if many of you remember from the Brett Kavanaugh hearing. There was a point where...
Which part?
Yeah, it's so hard to, there's so much happens.
Party calendar, what?
Yeah, there was one part where one of the senators was trying to get in the elevator just for senators, and he was confronted by these women who were expressing a great deal of anger at him, and it was over and over and again on the news. And the former mayor of New Orleans, Mitch Landrieu, said, well, that looked pretty rough for a United States senator, but when you're mayor, that happens 7 times while you're buying milk. And there's a little bit of that's true. One thing that surprised me is how proximate this job is. I was recently back in DC for, again, kind of a mayor's climate conference. And on the way back, we experienced some plane problems. And I conducted basically maybe the first aviation town hall. Because as we sat on the tarmac, about 20, 30 people just, hey, Mayor, can I talk to you about one thing? But it's great. I think that shows people are engaged. If people quit being engaged, I think we're in trouble. Having people engaged, having them angry sometimes, having them making sure that you're holding government accountable and that we actually do get better and that we start sharing prosperity more equitably is a good thing. So I think the first surprise for me was how deeply engaged people are with their local government officials everywhere you go. The second is how difficult things are in this city. And maybe because I've seen the change over a period of years, and because I am able to travel through the world as someone who is not just white, but who did well in life, is this city grew so fast. I don't know anybody that doesn't have some kind of anxiety about whether they've got a home here. And it started with our communities of color who were pushed out first, and suddenly the ones left behind were, it's like, where is my community? How do I still have not just the people who I know and grew up around, but the restaurants I like, the stores I like, the places I can buy the food I like, that sense of self. But our middle class now in Seattle, if you didn't own a house in Seattle, good luck buying one now if you're on a middle class salary, because the mean is over $700,000 for the median income house. When I moved back to Seattle in 1991, I think the big house I bought in the south part of Seattle was a little over $200,000. So that's how much it's changed in such a short period of time. And so the thing that surprised me is how much we have to do to get back to a place where people feel like this is their home, not just today, but the home where their kids can be and their kids can be. And that's the part that I think that has surprised me the most, is how in every step we kind of fell behind, and we've got a lot of catching up to do. But the other part that is awesome, our challenges are great, but I wouldn't be mayor anywhere else in America, or maybe in the world. I think we got the best people in this city, and we have sometimes some very heated political debates and a lot of enthusiasm. I think that's good. I think it's good for us. I think it's good for America. And so our challenges are great, but I think our people are greater.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mayor Durkan. And before you applaud, I just wanted to announce that our next...
You get credit for this, and you'll get A's. No,
yeah, there's that.
Our next conversation will be January 21st, and the topic will be Restoring Civility to the Legislative and Electoral Process, Politics in the Post-Trump Era. Thank you, Mayor Durkan, for coming tonight.
Thank you, guys. Thank you, everybody.